The sun was a hammer swung by a merciless god, and the land was the anvil. It beat down on the cracked, thirsty earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves, making the horizon dance and wobble. Out here, there was no shade to be found, no comfort to be had. There was only an endless sea of parched buffalo grass, bleached the color of old bone, that rustled and hissed in a wind that offered no relief, a wind that felt like the breath from a kiln. In the far distance, a line of hazy, blue-gray mountains clawed at the bleached sky, their peaks like the jagged teeth of a skull half buried in the dust. The silence was a physical presence, so profound and complete that a man could hear the thrum of his own blood in his ears. It was a silence broken only by that lonesome wind and the steady, rhythmic plodding of a single horse. Elias Thorne rode through the heart of this desolation, a solitary figure in a landscape that swallowed men whole. He sat easy in the saddle of his buckskin. Dust, a horse as steady and enduring as the man who rode him. Elias was in his late 20s, but the sun and sorrow had carved lines into his face that belonged to a much older man. His frame was lean, stripped of all but muscle and sinew by a life lived on the move. His eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, had seen too much to hold any youthful light. They were watchful, somber, and held a deep, settled sadness that rarely wavered. His hands, calloused and brown, rested on the reins with a practiced gentleness, the same hands that could draw the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip with a speed that was anything but gentle. As dust picked his way across the parched plains, Elias's mind drifted to the place it always went when the silence grew too loud. The nightmare came to him even in the daylight. A flickering vision behind his eyes. Fire. Always the fire. Orange and yellow and hungry. Consuming the small, proud cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. The screams followed, sharp and terrible, cutting through the memory of the outlaws' drunken laughter. He could see their faces then, the ones that mattered, the ones that were burned forever into his soul. Sarah, his wife, her face pale with terror, her arms wrapped around their boy, and little Thomas, just 4 years old, his eyes wide with a confusion that was worse than fear. Elias had been struck down, left for dead in the dirt, and had woken to the smell of smoke, the roar of the flames, and a silence that was more horrible than any scream. He had woken up alone. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of drifting, of running from the ghosts that whispered his name in the sighing of the wind. He was not looking for gold or glory. He was not looking for a fight. He was looking for a quiet place, a place where the past might finally lose his trail, a place where he could sleep a whole night through without waking up to the smell of smoke that was not there. But inside him, buried beneath the grief, was a hard kernel of justice. It was a quiet, cold determination to stand against the kind of casual brutality that had shattered his world. He would never start a fight, but God help the man who started one in front of him against someone who could not defend themselves. The raw, angular shape of a town began to form in the heat haze ahead. Redemption Gulch. The name was a bitter joke. Elias thought there was no redemption to be found in these hard places. Only survival. The town looked as if it had been clawed from the dust by a desperate hand. It was a jumble of raw lumber buildings, some with proud, false fronts that tried to hide their shabby reality. A single, wide street, more mud than dirt, ran through its center, deeply rutted by the wheels of wagons and churned by the hooves of countless horses. An air of tension hung over the place like the dust itself, a feeling of simmering grievances and watchful suspicion. Elias rode slowly down the main street, his eyes taking in everything. He saw men with hardened faces and suspicious eyes who paused to watch him pass, their hands never straying far from their sides. He saw women in faded calico dresses, their faces weary and drawn, hurrying along the boardwalks with their heads down. He saw the arrogant swagger of a group of cowhands spilling out of a saloon, their spurs jingling with a sound that was both a boast and a challenge. They all wore the same brand, not on their hides, but in their bearing. They belonged to someone. He found a room in a boarding house at the end of the street. run by a tired-looking woman who asked no questions so long as his dollar was real. The room was small and clean enough, with a window that looked out over a dusty alley. After settling dust in the livery, giving the stable hand specific instructions that were backed by a level stare, Elias made his way to the saloon. It was called the Gilded Cage, another name that dripped with irony. Inside, it was dim and smelled of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and sweat. He took a seat at a small table in the corner, ordered a whiskey, and made it last. He was a listener, not a talker. In a town like this, a man could learn everything he needed to know just by keeping his mouth shut and his ears open. He learned the name of the man who owned the swaggering cowhands, Silas Croft. He learned that Croft also owned the sprawling C-Bar ranch that choked the valley, owned the saloon he was sitting in, and owned the mercantile across the street. It became clear, from the hushed and resentful tones of the other patrons, that Silas Croft also owned the town sheriff, a man named Brody. Croft was the uncrowned king of Redemption Gulch, a man whose power was absolute and whose appetite for more was insatiable. He was, Elias gathered, a man who took what he wanted, and there was no one in this town with the sand to tell him no. The next morning, the hammer of the sun was already beating down on the town when Elias saw her. He was standing on the porch of the boarding house, rolling a cigarette, when he noticed the small, makeshift market set up near the town well. There were only a few sellers, a farmer with a wagon of dusty potatoes, an old woman with a basket of eggs, and a young woman standing behind a small table laden with bright red tomatoes, green beans, and summer squash. She was the first thing of true beauty he had seen in this God-forsaken town. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, thick and dark, pulled back from a face that was all quiet strength and intelligence. Her skin was the color of warm honey, and her eyes were large and dark and held a resilience that seemed to defy the harshness of the world around her. But as Elias watched, he saw the reason for the invisible circle of emptiness around her stall. He saw the way the other women in the market would pull their children a little closer when they passed, whispering behind their hands. He saw the way men looked at her, their gazes a crude mixture of raw desire and open contempt. She was an outsider. Elias learned her name from the liveryman later that morning, Amara Flores, the daughter of a Mexican vaquero, a man who had been known and respected for his skill with horses, and a white schoolteacher who had come west full of hope and books. Both were dead now, taken by a fever 2 winters back, leaving their daughter alone. She was tolerated because she bothered no one, but she was never, and would never be, accepted. She was a woman of mixed heritage in a town that saw the world in black and white. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate the very people who scorned her. She met their cold stares not with anger, but with a calm indifference that was a shield against their prejudice. Her focus was on the simple, brutal calculus of survival. She lived alone on a small plot of land her parents had homesteaded, a few miles out of town. The plot itself was modest, but it held something more valuable than gold in this dry land. A small, year-round creek, fed by a mountain spring. It was the only reliable source of water for miles, save for the wide, muddy river that cut through the heart of Silas Croft's massive ranch. As the morning wore on, a large, imposing figure made his way across the street, parting the sparse crowd like a bull pushing through a herd of yearlings. Elias recognized the bearing of the man instantly, even before he saw the expensive hat and the tailored coat. It was Silas Croft. He was in his 50s, with a barrel chest and a face that was fleshy but hard, dominated by a pair of cold, calculating gray eyes. He did not look at the other stalls. He walked directly to Amara's. He stopped in front of her table, looking down at her vegetables with a dismissive air. He was not there to buy. He was there to intimidate. "Morning, Miss Flores," Croft said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the street. "Good of you to bring some color to our dusty town." Amara simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Croft." He picked up a tomato, weighed it in his palm, and set it back down as if it were contaminated. "It occurs to me," he said, his voice dropping, "that it is a hard life for a woman alone out here. A dangerous life." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. "That little plot of yours, it is no place for you. I would be willing to take it off your hands. For your own good. Of course, I could give you enough to see you on your way to a bigger city, a place where you might fit in better." His offer was an insult, the price he surely had in mind a fraction of what the land and its water were worth. Amara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice was steady when she replied, "The land was my parents'. I have no intention of selling. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Croft." A smile touched Croft's lips, but it was a cold, predatory thing that did not reach his eyes. "A stubborn woman," he said softly, leaning forward slightly. "Stubbornness can be a virtue. It can also get you killed. Think on my offer. It is a dangerous world for a woman with no protection." The threat was no longer veiled. It was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy and walked away, leaving a chill in the air despite the blistering heat. Elias, watching from the shade of the porch, felt his jaw tighten until it ached. He had seen men like Croft before. They were bullies who used their power like a club, convinced of their own superiority, crushing anything and anyone who stood in their way. But he had also seen the quiet, defiant strength in Amara Flores's eyes. She was afraid. He could see that, but she was not broken. Not yet. That night, sleep would not come to Elias. The cheap mattress in his boarding house room felt lumpy. The air was stuffy, and the ghosts were particularly loud. He could hear his wife's laughter, see his son's bright smile. The memories were a torment, a reminder of a life that had been stolen from him. He needed air. He needed the clean, cold silence of the open country. He dressed quietly, slipped out of the boarding house, and saddled dust. He would ride out of town, away from the stench of whiskey and resentment, and sleep under the vast, uncaring canvas of the stars. He rode towards the low and dark hills that cupped the valley, the same direction he had seen Amara Flores take her wagon earlier in the day. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, but the stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet. The silence he had been seeking began to settle over him, broken only by the creak of his saddle and the soft fall of dust's hooves. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a faint, unnatural glow against the black horizon, a dirty orange smudge where no light should be. He reined dust to a halt, his body going still. He watched as the glow brightened, pulsating like a malevolent heart, the orange deepening to a pulsing, angry red. A column of dark smoke began to smudge the stars. A cold dread, heavy and familiar, washed over him. He knew that direction. It was where he had seen the wisp of smoke from a chimney earlier, where the liveryman had said the Flores homestead was the one with the well-tended garden, the one with the creek. He did not need to think. He dug his heels into Dust's flanks, and the buckskin surged forward into a gallop. The wind whipped at his face, but it carried a new scent now, a scent that was burned into his memory, the acrid, sickening smell of burning pine and shattered lives. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear for himself, but with a terrible, rising panic that was a perfect echo of a night 5 years ago. He topped a small rise, and the scene exploded into view below him. Amara's small cabin was no longer a home. It was an inferno. The fire was a living, roaring beast, its flames leaping 50 feet into the night sky, consuming the dry timber of the cabin with a terrifying, insatiable hunger. The heat rolled towards him in a physical wave, and the sound was a deafening roar, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting beams. Embers, like a swarm of angry fireflies, swirled up into the darkness. Against this hellish backdrop, he saw a silhouette. It was Amara. She was desperately trying to lead a frightened horse from a small corral next to the cabin, its own timbers already alight. She had the reins, but the animal was wild with terror, its eyes rolling. As Elias watched, a heavy, burning beam from the cabin roof crashed down onto the corral fence. The sound, like a cannon shot, sent the horse into a final, panicked frenzy. It reared, tearing the reins from her hands, and bolted into the darkness. At the same moment, another beam gave way, crashing down near the corral gate, and the whole side of the cabin began to sag inwards. The collapse threw a shower of sparks and flaming debris into the air, cutting her off, trapping her near the collapsing structure. Smoke and flames swirled around her, and she disappeared from his view. Without a second thought, Elias was off his horse. He yanked the canteen from his saddle, pulled his neckerchief from his throat, and soaked it with the precious water. Tying the damp cloth over his nose and mouth, he ran headlong into the maelstrom of swirling smoke and stinging embers. The roar of the fire was all-consuming, a physical force that vibrated through the soles of his boots. The heat was scorching, blistering his exposed skin. He found her in the chaotic, flickering light. She was on her knees, coughing violently, her body racked with spasms as she tried to draw a clean breath from the thick, choking smoke. She was disoriented, terrified, her face smudged with soot and illuminated by the destructive light of her burning home. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, paralyzed by the sight of her entire world turning to ash before her. Elias grabbed her arm. "We have to go, now!" he yelled, his voice muffled by the cloth. She resisted for a moment, pulling against his grip. Her gaze was locked on the inferno, her face a mask of shock and profound despair. Everything she had was in there. Her mother's books, her father's saddle, the rocking chair he had made. It was not just wood and cloth that was burning. It was her memories, her security, her last fragile connection to the parents she had lost. The strength that had held her up in town was gone, burned away. She sagged against him, a dead weight, overwhelmed by the horror and the suffocating smoke. He did not hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms, one arm under her knees, the other securely around her back. She was surprisingly light, as if the fire had already consumed part of her. He turned and carried her away from the collapsing cabin, away from the ravenous heat. Embers rained down around them, some landing on his shirt and burning small, stinging holes. She was barely conscious, her head resting against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged. As he moved into the relative safety of the night, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at the face of the stranger who held her. His features were stark in the terrible, flickering light of the fire, a strong jaw, grim mouth, and eyes that held a world of pain she was too dazed to comprehend. Her mind was a blur of terror, loss, and a strange, sudden sense of absolute safety in the solid strength of his arms. A hoarse, desperate whisper escaped her smoke-raw throat, a plea born from the raw terror of near death and the shocking intimacy of a stranger's embrace being her only salvation. "Touch me," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the fire's roar. "Before it's too late." It was not a request for passion, but a primal, desperate need to feel a solid, living human presence. It was a plea to confirm that she was still alive in a world that was literally burning down around her. A plea to be anchored to reality before the horror consumed her completely. The fire that burned was the one devouring her home, and it was the one raging in her soul. Elias heard her words, and they struck a chord deep within his own scarred heart. He understood that plea better than she could ever know. His own traumatic memories of fire and loss surged, threatening to pull him under. But the woman in his arms was real, and she was alive, and she needed him. He tightened his grip, holding her closer to his chest, a silent promise of protection. He carried her out into the darkness, away from the roaring flames, the burning wreck of her life lighting their path. The day broke not with a triumphant sun, but with a sickly, gray light that filtered through a sky choked with smoke. It was the color of old dishwater, casting no warmth, only a pale, revealing glare on the devastation below. The air was thick and foul, heavy with the acrid, wet smell of charred wood and burned earth. All that remained of Amara's home was a blackened skeleton of timbers, still hissing and whispering with pockets of steam, a smoldering testament to the night's fury. Elias had not left her side. He had carried her a safe distance from the fire and laid her on his bedroll, where she had slipped in and out of a restless, coughing sleep. He kept a silent vigil through the long, dark hours, watching the flames die down to angry red embers, his own ghosts keeping him company. He had used the salve from his saddlebag to gently tend to the angry red welts on her arms and the back of her neck where embers had landed, his touch as light as he could make it. He was a man who knew the anatomy of a burn all too well. When Amara finally awoke, truly and completely, the sun was a weak disk in the hazy sky. For a moment, she lay still, confusion clouding her mind. Then memory returned, a brutal, physical blow that stole her breath. She sat up, her dark eyes fixing on the ruin. A low sound, a whimper of pure anguish, escaped her lips. Elias, who had been sitting by a small, smokeless fire he had built, stood but did not approach her. He gave her the space she needed, his presence a quiet, grounding force in a world that had come unmoored. He offered no useless platitudes, no easy words of comfort that would only sound like lies. His silent empathy, the shared understanding of loss he held in his somber gaze, was more meaningful than any words could be. She rose to her feet as if in a trance, her body trembling with a deep, shuddering tremor she could not control. She walked into the field of ash, her bare feet sinking into the warm, gray powder. The devastation was absolute. It was not just a burned house, it was an excavated grave. She reached down and her fingers brushed against the blackened, twisted remains of the small rocking chair her father had carved for her mother. She saw the warped, melted lump of pewter that had been her mother's favorite serving spoon. She saw the scorched metal frame of the bed where she had been born. Each object was a fresh stab of pain. This was not the loss of things. It was the loss of everything that had tied her to her past, to her family, to her very identity. While she walked through the ghost of her life, Elias moved with quiet purpose. He walked into the scrubland behind the ruin, his low, calm voice a soft murmur in the morning air. A few minutes later, he returned, leading her frightened horse by a hackamore fashioned from a length of rope. The animal's eyes were still wide, its nostrils flared, but it allowed Elias to lead it, soothed by his steady hand and calm presence. He tied the reins to a surviving fence post and left the horse for her to find when she was ready. When Amara finally turned away from the ashes, her face was a pale, tear-streaked mask of grief, but her eyes held a new, hard emptiness. She saw her horse, safe and sound, and a flicker of something, gratitude, surprise, passed through her gaze as she looked at Elias. He simply nodded, then turned his attention back to the wreckage. "We should see what can be saved," he said, his voice practical, pulling her from the grip of her despair. His competence was a lifeline. He waded into the still smoldering debris, heedless of the heat, and began to pull things from the ash. There was not much. A handful of her father's tools from a chest that had been partially buried, their wooden handles burned away, but the steel still good. A cast-iron skillet, blackened but intact. A small, scorched wooden box that held a few of her mother's heirlooms, a silver locket, tarnished but whole, and a string of fire-cracked pearls. Each salvaged item was a tiny victory against the total annihilation. Then, using a fire-hardened beam as a lever, Elias began to construct a crude shelter. He cleared a patch of ground, used salvaged timbers to create a lean-to against a rock outcropping, and stretched the heavy canvas tarp from his bedroll over the top to form a roof. He worked with a quiet, focused determination that was a stark contrast to the spectacle that was beginning to arrive from town. They came in ones and twos, on horseback and in buggies, drawn by the column of smoke that still stained the sky. They were not a rescue party. They were gawkers. They sat on their horses at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, faint pity, and a smug, unspoken suspicion. The whispers started almost immediately, carried on the breeze to where Amara stood watching Elias work. "Did it herself, I reckon, for the insurance." A bitter laugh followed. There was no insurance. Trying to trap a man, more like a damsel in distress. Always knew she was trouble. That kind always is. Amara heard them. She stood a little straighter, her chin rising, the hard emptiness in her eyes turning to a cold, familiar defiance. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. An hour later, 2 more riders arrived. One was Sheriff Brody, a man with a drooping mustache and a perpetually worried expression, whose spine seemed to have been replaced with a length of cooked noodle. The other was Silas Croft. Croft dismounted with a contrived show of gravity, his face set in a mask of deep sympathy that fooled no one, least of all Amara. He walked towards her, his boots crunching in the ash, and removed his expensive hat. "My dear Miss Flores," he said, his voice oozing false condolence. "A terrible tragedy, simply terrible. When I heard the news, I rode out at once to offer my assistance." He gestured at the smoldering ruin. "This is precisely what I was afraid of. It is no place for a woman to be on her own. It is a sign." He let his gaze drift over to Elias, who had stopped his work and was now standing with a hammer in his hand, his expression unreadable. Croft turned back to Amara. "My offer still stands," he said, his voice low and intimate, as if sharing a secret. "I will take this cursed land off your hands, give you a fresh start. It is the Christian thing to do." The implication was as thick and foul as the smoke in the air. "See what happens when you refuse my protection. This world will burn you down. I am your only salvation." Though she was shaken, hollowed out by grief and exhaustion, a core of steel deep inside her ignited. She looked Silas Croft dead in the eye, her voice cold and clear. "The land is not for sale. Mr. Croft, not now, not ever." A flicker of raw fury crossed Croft's face before he could mask it. Elias took a half-step forward, so he was standing just beside and slightly behind Amara. He did not speak. He did not have to. He simply let his hand drop, his thumb coming to rest on the worn butt of his Colt. It was not a threat, not exactly. It was a statement of fact. The tension between the 3 of them was a palpable, dangerous thing. Sheriff Brody, who had been nervously watching the exchange, saw the thundercloud on Croft's face and decided it was time to perform his duty. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his tone already suggesting she was the one at fault. "Do you have any idea how this fire might have started? A lamp tipped over, maybe? An untended cooking fire?" "My lamp was out," Amara said, her voice flat. "The stove was cold." Brody nodded, scribbling in a small notebook. "I see. Any visitors? Anyone who might have held a grudge against you?" He glanced pointedly at Elias. "No," she said, her gaze unwavering. The sheriff sighed, as if greatly burdened by her lack of cooperation. He looked at the wreckage, kicked at a charred board, and snapped his notebook shut. "Well, without any witnesses, it is impossible to say. I will have to declare the cause of the fire inconclusive." He tipped his hat. "My condolences for your loss, ma'am." With that, the law in Redemption Gulch washed its hands of the matter. Croft gave Amara one last look, a look that promised this was not over, and mounted his horse. The 2 men rode away, leaving Amara and Elias alone once more in the field of ashes. Elias's decision to stay sealed his fate in the town. He was no longer just another nameless drifter passing through. He was the man who had stood with Amara Flores when he rode into town that afternoon for supplies. A sack of flour, coffee, bacon, and a new axe head. he was met with a wall of hostility. The bartender at the Gilded Cage, who had served him without issue the day before, suddenly found his hands too busy to draw a whiskey. "We do not serve your kind here," he grunted, not looking Elias in the eye. The liveryman, who had been cordial enough, now had a sour look on his face and charged him double the usual rate for a bag of oats for dust. As Elias walked down the boardwalk, two of Croft's men, the same ones he had seen swaggering out of the saloon, came towards him. They did not part to let him pass. One of them turned his shoulder at the last second, slamming into Elias hard. "Watch where you are going, friend," the man sneered. Elias did not rise to the bait. He simply absorbed the impact, met the man's belligerent stare with his own flat, cold gaze, and stepped around him without a word. His stony stoicism, his refusal to be provoked, seemed to irritate them more than any angry retort would have. He was an outsider in every sense now, a pariah by choice, the man who sided with the woman they whispered about, the woman they called the half-breed. The trouble he had avoided found him later, behind the general store. As he was loading his supplies onto dust, two of Croft's men cornered him, the same two from the boardwalk. "Got a lot of nerve. Stranger," the first one said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boots. "Showing your face in this town after shacking up with that." He used a crude term that made Elias's hands clench into fists. "She is not your concern," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is when she brings trash like you into our town," the second man snarled, stepping forward. The fight was brief, brutal, and one-sided. They thought they were jumping a tired drifter. They did not know they were facing a man who had been stripped of everything but his bones and his will to survive. Elias moved with a coiled, deadly efficiency. He sidestepped the first man's clumsy punch, drove the heel of his hand into the man's nose with a sickening crunch, and then delivered a hard, precise blow to the second man's gut that doubled him over. Gasping for air, it was over in less than 10 seconds. He left them groaning in the dirt, picked up his sack of flour, and rode out of town. He returned to the homestead as dusk was settling, the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and orange. Amara was sitting by the fire he had built earlier, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She saw the split in his lip and the raw, bruised skin on his knuckles as he dismounted. She said nothing, but her eyes were full of a quiet, worried concern. Later, after they had eaten a silent meal of bacon and coffee, she motioned for him to sit. She took a clean rag and dipped it in the warm water from the kettle, then knelt before him. Her touch was gentle, almost hesitant, as she carefully cleaned the dried blood from his lip. The campfire cast a warm, flickering light on their faces, creating an intimate circle in the vast, encroaching darkness. Her proximity was intense. He could smell the faint scent of wood smoke in her hair and feel the warmth of her breath on his cheek. They did not speak, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with a powerful, growing awareness of each other. In the soft firelight, he saw the kindness and the incredible strength that lay beneath her guarded exterior. She was not just a victim. She was a survivor. And as she tended to his injuries, her focus absolute. She saw the deep well of honor and quiet pain behind his stoic mask. He was not just a drifter. He was a protector. He had taken a beating for her name. In this small, quiet act of care, a bond was forged between them, deeper than any words. They shared a meal of rabbit stew that Elias cooked the next day, and in the simple act of eating together, they created a small pocket of peace and domesticity amidst the ruins of her life and the hostility of the world around them. They fell into a routine born of necessity and survival. Elias taught her how to handle the old Winchester rifle her father had left her. He stood behind her, his body close to hers, his hands covering hers on the stock and barrel to show her how to aim. The contact was practical, instructional, but it sent a jolt of unintentional, electric intimacy through both of them. She, in turn, showed him the hidden places on her land that had survived the fire's rage. a small, secret spring that bubbled up cold and clear from between two rocks. The hardy desert wildflowers that grew in the shade of a small canyon, their colors shockingly vibrant against the red rock. They began to talk more, sharing small, careful pieces of their lives. He learned of her deep love for her parents and her dream of one day expanding her garden, of being beholden to no one. She learned that he knew how to read. And one evening, as they sat by the fire, he quietly recited a few lines of a poem from memory. It was something his wife had loved, he explained, his voice soft with the memory. These revelations were like small, careful chisels, chipping away at the walls of loneliness each had built around themselves. The land itself seemed to mirror their emotional state. The West was a place of brutal, stunning contrasts. The days were harsh, the sun a punishing weight. The nights were dangerously cold, forcing them to huddle near the fire for warmth. One night, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, the sky erupting in a terrifying display of lightning and concussive thunder. They were forced into the cramped, makeshift shelter, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the darkness as the storm raged, the lightning illuminating their faces in stark, fleeting flashes. The storm was both terrifying and cleansing. When it passed, the air was crisp and clean, the dust was settled, and in the morning light, the desert landscape was shockingly green and alive with color. It was a reflection of the fragile hope that was beginning to bloom between them, a delicate thing in a harsh and unforgiving environment. But Silas Croft had not forgotten them. The intimidation from his men escalated. They no longer bothered with insults in town. They brought the fight to the homestead. They would ride by in the dead of night, their horses thundering past the small shelter, shouting taunts into the darkness. One afternoon, while Elias was away hunting, they stampeded Amara's few remaining cattle, a half-dozen scrawny longhorns, scattering them for miles across the open territory. It was a cruel, petty act designed to break her spirit. When Elias returned, he saw the tracks and the despair in her eyes. Without a word, he filled his canteen, took some jerky, and set out on dust. He was gone for 2 full days, tracking the cattle across the rugged, unforgiving land. He returned late on the second evening, exhausted and covered in dust, but driving the small herd before him. He had found every last one. That act solidified everything. He was no longer just a man who was helping. He was actively fighting for her, for the small patch of life they were trying to build from the ashes, their shared struggle, their mutual defiance against a world determined to break them, forged a powerful, unspoken bond. The intense connection that had been sparked in the chaos of the fire was now being fanned into a steady, burning flame by mutual respect, shared hardship, and a deep, growing emotional connection. They were 2 outcasts, 2 survivors, building a fortress for 2 against the wilderness. The fierce, desperate fight for survival softened, giving way to the slow, deliberate rhythm of rebuilding a life. The days were no longer measured by shocks and setbacks, but by the quiet, shared progress of work done together. The initial, raw connection forged in the heart of the fire began to blossom into something deeper, more profound. A love as tenacious as the desert wildflowers that pushed their way through the hard-packed earth. The part opened on a morning painted in the soft hues of a new beginning. Elias was repairing the last section of the corral fence, the one that had been destroyed in the fire. His movements were economical and sure, the steady thud of his hammer a rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet sounds of the morning. A short distance away, Amara was on her knees in the dark, rich earth near the creek bed, with painstaking care. She was replanting a small section of her garden, coaxing new life from the soil that the fire had scorched. She had salvaged a few seeds, and with borrowed cuttings from the wild berry bushes in the canyon, she was meticulously creating a small patch of green hope. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements synchronized, each aware of the other's presence without the need for words. It was in these small, everyday moments that their love solidified. taking root in the shared soil of their new life. Elias would pause in his work, leaning against a fence post, and watch her. He marveled at her resilience, at the gentle way she handled the fragile seedlings, her hands covered in dirt, her face serene with concentration. She was not just replanting a garden, she was reclaiming her life, refusing to let the violence of one night define her future. He had never known a woman with such a quiet, unyielding strength. She, in turn, would glance up from her work and see him, a tall, solid figure against the vast, empty landscape. His steadfast presence was a comfort so deep it had become essential, like the water from the creek or the warmth of the sun. He was the anchor that kept her from being swept away by the grief and fear. He had walked into her life out of smoke and chaos, a stranger who had become her shelter, her protector, her partner in this small, defiant stand against the world. A profound sense of gratitude would wash over her, so potent it was almost painful. The harsh landscape around them, once so threatening, seemed to soften when they looked at it together. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and watch the setting sun bleed across the sky, painting the distant mountains in brilliant, breathtaking hues of orange, pink, and deep purple. It was a spectacle of wild, untamed beauty they shared in silence, finding a deep and abiding solace in the natural world that had otherwise been so unforgiving. They were two solitary souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. One afternoon, when Elias rode into Redemption Gulch for salt and coffee, he saw a notice tacked to the post outside the general store. The town was holding a dance in the main hall to celebrate the harvest. When he told Amara about it, her reaction was immediate. A shadow passed over her face, and she shook her head. "We cannot go, Elias." "Why not?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "You know why," she said, her voice quiet. "The way they look at me, the way they look at you now, because of me, it would be a misery." Elias took the small trowel from her hand and set it aside, then took her hands in his. They were rough and calloused, like his own. "Amara," he said, his voice low and serious, "we cannot let them do this. We cannot let Croft and their hate push us into the shadows and make us live like we are ashamed. We have nothing to be ashamed of." His quiet strength was a tangible thing, a force that flowed from his hands into hers, giving her courage. "I want to dance with you." And so, they went. Amara wore a simple blue dress she had managed to salvage and repair, and she had woven a few wildflowers into her dark, braided hair. When Elias saw her, standing in the light of the setting sun, he thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. They rode into town together on dust, arriving as the music from a lively fiddle was spilling out of the open doors of the town hall. As they stepped across the threshold, their entrance had the effect of a stone dropped into a still pond. The fiddle music faltered, scratching to a discordant halt. A wave of hostile silence washed over the room, and every head turned towards them. Conversations died. Laughter ceased. For a moment, the only sound was the scuff of their boots on the wooden floor. Then, the whispers began, a low, sibilant hiss that followed them like a cloud of flies. People deliberately turned their backs. Women who had been smiling moments before now wore masks of cold disapproval. They were utterly, completely isolated, an island of two in a sea of silent scorn. Amara felt a flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, and she instinctively moved to turn and leave. But Elias's hand was firm on the small of her back. He did not look at the hostile faces. His gaze was fixed on her. "Do not give them that satisfaction," he murmured, his voice for her alone. Undeterred, he led her not into the center of the hostile room, but through it, towards the open doors on the far side that led out onto a wide, covered porch. The air was cooler out here, the moonlight soft and pale. In a shadowed corner, away from the judgmental eyes, A single candle flickered in a glass lantern on a nearby railing, casting a warm, intimate glow. The fiddle music started up again inside, the sound now faint and distant, a muted backdrop to the chirping of the crickets. There, on the quiet, moonlit porch, Elias turned to her. He took her gently into his arms, his calloused hand resting softly on her waist. He did not speak. He simply looked into her eyes, and in their depths, she saw a devotion so absolute it stole her breath, and they began to dance, slowly, gracefully. They moved together in the shadows, their steps sure and synchronized. It was a defiant act of love, a quiet declaration that their world was not in that hateful room, but right here, with each other. It was a deeply romantic, emotionally charged moment, just the two of them, the flickering candlelight dancing on their faces, their eyes locked. The rest of the world, with all its cruelty and prejudice, faded away until it was nothing at all. Their conversations, which had once been careful explorations, deepened into the sharing of souls. A few nights after the dance, they were sitting by the campfire, the flames crackling and spitting sparks up towards a brilliant canopy of stars. The Milky Way was a luminous, shimmering river across the black velvet of the sky. In the comfortable silence, Elias finally unlocked the last, most painful door to his past. He began to speak, his voice low and raspy with unshed grief, and he recounted the night of the raid in painful, excruciating detail. He spoke of the things he never spoke of, the sensory details that haunted his waking hours, the smell of cheap whiskey on the outlaw's breath, mixed with the choking smoke, the chilling, soulless sound of their laughter as they smashed the things his wife, Sarah, had treasured. He described the sight of his own home burning, a hellish roaring pyre that mirrored the one Amara had endured, and he confessed his own terrible helplessness as he was knocked unconscious, the feeling of the world going black, only to wake up to a nightmare from which he had never truly escaped. His voice broke as he spoke the hardest words. "I should have died with them," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the flames. "A man is supposed to protect his family. I was right there, and I woke up. They did not. Sometimes I think that is the worst part of it all. Just waking up." He finally fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the cool night air. Amara listened without a single interruption, her heart aching for the unimaginable pain he had carried alone for so long. She did not offer empty words of comfort. Instead, her hand found his in the darkness between them, her fingers lacing through his. Her silent, compassionate presence was a balm to his old, festering wounds, a quiet message that he was no longer alone in his darkness. After a long moment, she began to speak, her own voice soft but clear. In return for his vulnerability, she offered hers. She told him of her own story of loss, not of a sudden, violent tragedy, but of a slow, cruel fading away. She spoke of her mother's long, painful decline from a fever, the endless nights of listening to her weak, ragged breaths. She described the profound, soul-crushing heartbreak of her father, a strong, vibrant man who simply faded away from grief in the year after his wife's death, as if his reason for living had been extinguished. And then she shared the wound that had never healed. She spoke of the social isolation she had felt for her entire life, the constant, draining pain of being judged for her blood, of being seen as something less than something other. She spoke of never truly belonging anywhere, of being caught between two worlds and welcome in neither. She revealed her deepest, most secret fear, a fear that was not of Silas Croft or his violence, but of dying alone, of having her life pass without anyone to remember she had ever been there, of being utterly and completely forgotten. In the sacred quiet of the starlit night, they laid their deepest vulnerabilities bare. They shared their scars, their ghosts, their most profound fears, and in doing so, they forged an unbreakable bond. They were no longer just two survivors clinging to each other for warmth. They were two souls who had found their other half in the vast, lonely wilderness, each seeing their own pain and hope reflected in the other's eyes. Later that night, after the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the moon had risen high in the sky, they went to the small, crude shelter that had become their home. The emotional intimacy of their confessions led, naturally and inevitably, to a physical one. It was not a sudden, passionate explosion, but a slow, deliberate, and deeply emotional culmination of everything they had been building since the night of the fire. In the quiet darkness of their shelter, with only the soft moonlight filtering through the canvas, he touched her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. It was an act of profound tenderness and healing. For Elias, it was the first time he had allowed himself to be truly close to a woman since his wife's death. It was a hesitant, terrifying, and beautiful step away from the ghosts that had held him captive for so long. For Amara, who had spent a lifetime guarding her heart against a hostile world, it was an act of ultimate trust, a surrender to a feeling of belonging she had never known. Their intimacy was a sacred sanctuary, a moment where the harsh, judgmental world outside ceased to exist. Their gentle touches and quiet, whispered words spoke of love, of acceptance, of a shared future. It was a moment of pure, transcendent hope, a promise that even from the deepest ashes of tragedy, a new and beautiful life could grow. But their newfound happiness was a fragile bubble in a world full of sharp edges. Silas Croft had heard about their appearance at the dance. He saw their public defiance not as a simple act of two people in love, but as a direct challenge to his authority, an intolerable insult from the woman who had refused him and the drifter who stood with her. His rage, cold and calculating, demanded a response. He could no longer tolerate their existence on a piece of land he considered his by right. His campaign of terror ramped up, shifting from petty harassment to something far more sinister. A few days later, Amara went to the creek to fetch water and found a half-dozen trout floating belly up on the surface, their silvery scales catching the morning light. Further upstream, one of her cattle lay dead on the bank, its body bloated. Croft had sent one of his men to poison the creek upstream from her property, a cowardly act of sabotage that struck at the very heart of their survival. The water was now unsafe to drink. For 2 days, Elias worked under the blazing, merciless sun, his back straining, his body drenched in sweat, as he dug a new well by hand, searching for a clean source of water deep in the earth. Before they had realized the danger, Amara had already drunk some of the tainted water. She fell ill with a fever that left her weak and delirious. Elias nursed her back to health with a fierce, protective tenderness, spooning broth into her mouth, keeping cool cloths on her forehead, and never leaving her side until the fever broke. Croft's men, emboldened by their master's renewed aggression, became bolder. They were no longer just shouting insults from a distance. They were actively trying to provoke Elias into a fight he could not win. The next time he went to town, they cornered him in the alley beside the saloon. There were 4 of them this time. "Heard your woman was sick," one of them sneered. "Maybe this land is just too much for her." "You ought to listen to Mr. Croft," another added, moving to block Elias's path. "Take his offer and get out of here before something worse happens." They taunted him, insulted Amara with crude, vile language, trying to bait him into reaching for the Colt at his hip. Elias knew their goal. If he drew his gun, even in self-defense, Sheriff Brody would be there in an instant, and he would be arrested, or more likely, shot dead. He stood there, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white, and endured the humiliation with a stoic, deadly silence. He met their leering faces with a gaze as hard and unyielding as granite, a gaze that promised a reckoning at a time and place of his choosing. His refusal to break, to give them the violence they craved, only infuriated them more. They let him go, but the constant threat now hung over his and Amara's love like a dark, heavy storm cloud, a promise of a coming tragedy. Their happiness was real, a precious, vibrant thing they had built together. But they both knew, in the quiet, unspoken moments, that it was built on borrowed time. This knowledge made every shared smile, every gentle touch, every quiet evening watching the sunset, all the more poignant, a fleeting, beautiful treasure held in the face of the coming storm. For a time, a fragile peace settled over the homestead. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt like hope. Elias finished digging the new well, and the water he drew from it was deep, cold, and pure. Amara, having recovered from her fever, moved with a renewed, if cautious, lightness. Their small, fortified homestead, built from salvaged timbers and sheer will, felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Their love, which had been a desperate spark in the darkness, had deepened into a powerful, resilient partnership that was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. In the quiet evenings, sitting together and watching the stars emerge, they would allow themselves to believe, just for a moment, that they might actually win. They had survived the fire that should have destroyed Amara. They had survived the town's scorn, which should have driven Elias away. They had survived the poisoned creek, which should have broken them. They began to feel that their endurance, their simple, stubborn refusal to be defeated, might just be enough to outlast Silas Croft's malice. This glimmer of hope, so new and precious, was a dangerous thing. It was the warmth of the sun before the blizzard, the calm before the storm, and it would make the tragedy to come all the more devastating. In Redemption Gulch, Silas Croft was not a man who tolerated failure, especially his own. The continued existence of Elias Thorne and Amara Flores on that small patch of land was a constant, public rebuke to his power. His attempts at intimidation and sabotage had not worked. They had only seemed to forge the two outcasts into a stronger unit. He realized that as long as Elias Thorne was alive to stand beside her, Amara would never break. Therefore, Elias had to be removed, not driven off, not beaten down. He had to be gone, permanently and legally, in a way that would cement Croft's power over the valley forever. And so, he orchestrated his final, cruelest plan. His chosen pawn was a man named Jebediah Jeb Stone, one of his most loyal ranch hands. Jeb was as strong as an ox and fiercely devoted to Croft, but possessed the unfortunate combination of a weak will and a dim mind. He was the perfect instrument. The first act of the play was staged in the Gilded Cage Saloon on a busy Saturday afternoon. Croft, ensuring he had a large audience, confronted Jeb at the bar. His voice boomed through the saloon, thick with manufactured rage. "I looked at the books this morning. Jeb," he roared, slamming his hand on the bar so hard the glasses jumped. $100 missing from the payroll chest, and you were the last one with the key." Jeb, utterly bewildered, could only stammer, "But, boss, I swear." "Do not lie to me," Croft bellowed, his face turning a theatrical shade of purple. "I took you in when no one else would, and you repay me with theft. You are fired. Get your things and get off my land. If I ever see your face again, I will have the sheriff throw you in a cell and let you rot." He made a great show of it, a performance of betrayal and righteous anger for the benefit of the entire saloon. Jeb, humiliated and confused, his pleas of innocence ignored, stumbled out into the street. The whispers started immediately. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. The stage was set. Later that night, as a sliver of moon hung in the sky, a lone rider approached the homestead. Elias and Amara were cleaning up after their meager supper when they heard the hoofbeats. Elias was instantly on alert, his hand moving to his Colt. He stepped outside, positioning himself in the shadows of the lean-to. The rider was a young cowhand Elias recognized as one of Croft's, a man named Miller. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around. "Mr. Thorne?" he called out, his voice shaky. Got a message for you. One of your neighbor's milk cows, the Higgins family, wandered off. She is stuck in a ravine a few miles east of here. Legs likely broken. Mr. Higgins sent me to fetch you, seeing as you are the closest help." Elias was immediately wary. The story felt thin, but the thought of an animal suffering and of a family losing a precious milk cow pricked at his conscience. It was the kind of trouble he could not ignore. "Why did not Higgins come himself?" Elias asked. His eyes narrowed. "His boy is sick with a fever," Miller said quickly, the lie coming a little too easily. "He could not leave him. Please, sir. The coyotes will get her if she is left out there all night." Against his better judgment, his innate decency won out. "All right," he said. He turned to Amara, who had come to the doorway, the old Winchester held loosely in her hands. "I will be back in an hour or two," he said, his voice low. "Stay inside. Keep the door barred and this rifle close. Do not open it for anyone." He looked her in the eyes, a silent, urgent warning passing between them. He saddled Dust and rode out, following Miller's vague directions into the darkness. The story was, of course, a lie. While Elias was chasing a phantom cow in the canyons, Silas Croft and another of his men, a ruthless gunslinger named Cole, were waiting in the darkness on the main trail back to town. They were not alone. A nervous, trembling Jeb was with them, lured there by a promise from Croft that all was forgiven, that there was a bonus waiting for him for his loyalty. "What are we waiting for, boss?" Jeb asked, his voice betraying his unease. Silas Croft placed a heavy hand on Jeb's shoulder. "For the end of our troubles, my boy," he said, his voice a low purr, and then he nodded to Cole. Jeb never saw the gun. The shot was a single, flat crack in the night, and it threw him forward into the dust. He was dead before he hit the ground, a bullet in his back. Croft took a .45 caliber pistol from his saddlebag, a common model, the same caliber as the one Elias Thorne carried, and carefully wiped it clean of his own prints. He placed it in the dirt a few feet from Jeb's body. Then he and Cole mounted up and disappeared into the night. Miles away, Elias found nothing. The ravine was empty. There were no tracks, no sign of a cow. A cold, hard knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. He had been played for a fool. He turned Dust and spurred him into a hard gallop, a terrible sense of dread washing over him. He thundered down the dark trail, his mind racing, cursing his own soft heart. He saw the body from 50 yards out, a dark shape crumpled in the moonlight. He reined Dust to a skidding halt and dismounted, his gun in his hand. He recognized the man instantly. It was Jeb, the cowhand Croft had fired so publicly. He was lying face down, a dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. Just as Elias knelt to check for a pulse, he already knew he would not find. He heard the sound of a dozen horses approaching at a run. He stood up, his heart sinking, as Sheriff Brody and a posse of a dozen men, led by a concerned and lantern-bearing Silas Croft, rode into view. They had him perfectly illuminated, kneeling over the fresh corpse, a smoking gun in his hand, or so it would seem. It was a perfect, diabolical trap. "There he is!" Croft shouted, pointing a finger that trembled with feigned shock and horror. "Just like I said, Sheriff, he ambushed him!" One of the deputies spotted the planted pistol in the dirt. "Sheriff, look here!" Sheriff Brody dismounted, his face a mixture of fear and grim duty. He looked from the body to Elias, then to the powerful man who held his leash. "Thorne," he said, his voice heavy, "drop your weapon." Elias did not move for a moment. He looked past the sheriff, his gaze locking onto Silas Croft. In the flickering lantern light, he saw the smug, triumphant look in the cattle baron's eyes. It was the look of a man who had just checkmated his opponent. In that instant, Elias Thorne knew he was a dead man. The arrest was swift and brutal. Elias did not resist violently. He knew it would be suicide, but he did not submit meekly. As the deputies grabbed his arms, he held Croft's gaze, his own eyes burning with a cold. defiant fire that promised a reckoning, whether in this life or the next. They bound his hands, dragged him onto a horse, and led him back to town like a prized kill. The news spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. By the time they threw Elias into the small, squalid town jail, a crowd had already gathered. The town's simmering prejudice erupted into a fever pitch. This was not a crime to be tried. It was a confirmation of everything they had wanted to believe. Elias was not an innocent man until proven guilty. He was a dangerous vagrant, a killer, the kind of trash that inevitably found its way to a woman like Amara Flores. His guilt was a foregone conclusion, sealed by his association with her. When the news reached Amara, carried by the cruel, gloating shouts of Croft's men as they rode past the homestead at dawn, her world collapsed. The strength that had carried her through the fire, the sickness, and the harassment simply shattered. She ran to the jail, but Sheriff Brody barred her way, his face impassive. "No visitors," he said, and closed the door on her desperate pleas. She was left completely alone, completely vulnerable. Croft's men now circled her homestead like vultures, their taunts more menacing and triumphant than ever. She was trapped, a prisoner on her own land, terrified and heartbroken. The world itself seemed to reflect her despair. A brutal heat wave settled over the valley, suffocating everything in a blanket of shimmering, oppressive heat. The dust, stirred by a hot, relentless wind, was everywhere. A fine, gritty powder that coated every surface, got into her food and water, and stung her eyes. It was a physical manifestation of her bleak, dirty, and hopeless reality. The trial, held 3 weeks later, was a farce. The circuit judge, a man named Peters, was a known friend and business associate of Silas Croft. He presided over the courtroom with a bored indifference. The prosecutor, a slick, ambitious man, painted Elias as a violent drifter with a history of trouble, a man with a simmering grudge who had sought bloody revenge against the poor, simple-minded Jeb Stone. Silas Croft took the stand and delivered a masterful, perjured performance, describing his sorrow over having to fire his once loyal hand, and his fear when the violent Thorn had made veiled threats against him and his men. The other cowhands who had been in on the plot provided corroborating testimony, their stories polished and airtight. Elias's court-appointed lawyer was a disheveled, sour-smelling old man who seemed incompetent at best and drunk at worst. He offered only a token defense. Elias spoke in his own defense, his voice low and steady, his shackled hands resting on the table before him. He told the simple, unvarnished truth about the setup, about Croft's threats, about the lure into the canyons, but in the hostile courtroom, his words were dismissed as the desperate, self-serving lies of a cornered killer. The jury, composed of 12 townsmen who were either on Croft's payroll or too terrified of him to act with a conscience, listened with closed faces. They were out for less than 10 minutes. The verdict was guilty. The emotional climax came at the sentencing the following day. Judge Peters looked down at Elias with cold, dispassionate eyes. "Elias Thorn," he intoned, his voice echoing in the silent, packed courtroom. "For the brutal, premeditated murder of Jebediah Stone, this court sentences you to be taken from this place to the town jail, and there be held until Friday next, 3 days from now, at which time you shall be taken to a place of execution and hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul." The courtroom erupted. A wave of grim satisfaction and bloodlust rippled through the crowd. Some men cheered. Amara, who had forced her way into the back of the courtroom, standing against the rear wall, let out a single, strangled cry of anguish, a sound of a heart being torn in two. In the ensuing chaos, her eyes found his across the crowded room, their gazes locked, a silent, desperate communication in the midst of the noise. His eyes were filled with a profound sorrow, not for himself, but for her. Hers were a torrent of shared agony, of desperate, helpless love, and of a devastating, final farewell. It was the moment their fragile happiness was officially executed. She was finally allowed one last visit that evening. The jail cell was a small, damp stone box that smelled of mildew and despair. Elias stood on one side of the iron bars, his wrists and ankles shackled. Amara stood on the other, the cold metal pressing into her hands. He tried to be strong for her, to offer her some final protection. "Amara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "you have to sell the land. Take Croft's offer. Take the money and leave this place. Go somewhere far away from here. Save yourself." Tears she had refused to shed in public now fell freely, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I will not leave you." "There is nothing left of me to leave," he said, his voice cracking with the effort of his composure. "He has won. Do not let him take you to... Please, promise me you will live." She pressed her hand flat against the cold bars. He moved forward, his own hand covering hers, their fingers touching through the gaps. They stood like that for a long moment, speaking of their love, a love that had been their sanctuary and had now become the very reason for his death sentence. It was a moment of profound, tragic intimacy, a final, stolen touch in a world that had torn them apart. "Promise me, Amara," he urged again, his eyes pleading. "Survive." She finally nodded, the word a choked sob in her throat. "I promise." But in the desolate, shattered landscape of her heart, she made another vow, a silent, fierce promise to the man she loved. She would fight for him. She did not know how, but she would fight until her last breath. The sheriff came then, his keys jangling with a terrible finality. "Time is up." He was taken away, back into the shadows of the cell, leaving Amara alone in the empty corridor. The silence he left behind was immense, heavy, filled with the finality of the sentence, a silence that held the sound of hammers on wood and the coming dawn of an execution. The finality of the iron door clanging shut was a sound that echoed in the deepest chambers of Amara's soul. She returned to the homestead not as a fighter, but as a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. The silence of the place, once a peaceful respite, was now a deafening, screaming void where Elias's presence should have been. She saw him everywhere, by the new well he had dug, his shoulders straining with effort, by the corral fence he had mended, his hands sure and steady, by the campfire where he had looked at her with such love in his eyes. He was gone, and the silence was his absence, a palpable thing that suffocated her. For a full day and a night, she was adrift in a vast, gray sea of despair. Grief was a leaden weight that paralyzed her limbs and clouded her mind. The sentence had been passed. The town, in its ignorant cruelty, had already condemned him, and Elias, in his quiet, noble way, had accepted his fate. There was no hope. The ticking clock of the 2 remaining days until the execution was a form of exquisite psychological torture, each passing hour a hammer blow against her heart. The brutal heat wave continued, the oppressive sun beating down on the small shelter, mirroring the white-hot fire of her anguish and her helpless, burning rage. She wandered the small piece of land they had fought for, her feet tracing the paths they had walked together. She touched the rough wood of the fence, remembering the feel of his hand closing over hers. She knelt by the small garden, remembering his quiet smile as she had planted the first seeds. She remembered his voice, his touch, his quiet, unshakable strength, and most vividly, she remembered his face in the dim light of the jail cell, resigned, yes, but so full of a fierce, desperate love for her. His final, urgent plea echoed in her mind. "Promise me you will live. Survive." And it was that memory, that final act of love, that finally snapped her out of her stupor. As the second sun began its descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the land, a new fire began to burn within her. a fire not of grief, but of pure, unadulterated defiance. To survive, as he had asked, could not mean to simply exist. To let Croft win and walk away a broken woman. To truly honor his plea, she had to fight. She would not just survive. She would fight for the life they were supposed to have. She would fight for him. Her mind, sharpened by a sudden, desperate clarity, began to race. She replayed every moment of the farcical trial, every word of testimony, searching for a crack, a flaw, a single loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of lies Croft had created. Her fight could not be one of physical strength against Croft's men. It had to be one of intelligence, of desperation, of a woman with nothing left to lose. And then she found it. Something seemingly insignificant, a small detail that had been buried under the weight of the larger, more dramatic lies. She remembered the testimony of a nervous young ranch hand named Billy, one of Croft's newer men. He had been called to establish the timeline, and under questioning from the prosecutor, he had mentioned that Silas Croft had paid him his week's wages in cash that very afternoon, the afternoon of the murder. He had said it with a note of pride, as if to show what a fair and timely boss Croft was. But that made no sense. Croft's entire public argument with Jeb, the supposed motive for Elias's revenge, was that he was furious because Jeb had stolen $100 from the payroll. Croft had claimed he could not pay Jeb because Jeb had robbed him. So how could he have paid Billy, and presumably all the other hands, on that same day? It was a small contradiction, a tiny, almost invisible tear in the fabric of the story. But it was a thread, and Amara seized it. She knew she could not go to Sheriff Brody. The man was a puppet, his strings held firmly in Croft's hand. She had to find real, undeniable proof herself. As darkness fell, a desperate plan began to form. She was going into the lion's den. Under the cover of a moonless, star-dusted night, she saddled her horse and rode towards Redemption Gulch. She tethered the animal in a thicket of mesquite well outside of town and slipped in on foot, a ghost moving through the shadows. Every sound was magnified in the tense silence. The creak of a loose floorboard on the boardwalk, the sudden, sharp bark of a dog down a side alley. Each sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She was an intruder in a hostile world, her heart hammering against her ribs. But her purpose was a cold, hard stone in her gut. Her target was the gilded cage. It was Croft's headquarters, his throne room. She knew it was a long shot, a fool's errand, but it was the only place she could think of. She hoped to find a ledger, a witness, anything that could corroborate the lie about the payroll. The saloon was dark, the front doors locked. She crept around to the back, her knife in her hand, and worked on the latch of a small storeroom window. The wood was old and soft, and after a few tense, agonizing minutes, it gave way. She slipped inside, silent as a cat. The saloon smelled of stale beer and desperation. Moonlight slanted through the dirty front windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. She was about to search the office behind the bar when she heard low, slurred voices coming from one of the back rooms. She froze, pressing herself into the shadows. Two of Croft's men she recognized from the trial, were still there, finishing a bottle of whiskey. "Gonna be a big day, Friday," one of them slurred. "The whole town'll be there to see him swing." "Serves him right," the other man grumbled. "Coming here, thinking he could stand against the boss?" He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Poor dumb Jeb. Never saw it coming. Too stupid to see what the boss was really paying him for." The first man made a shushing sound, his voice suddenly nervous. "Shut your mouth, you fool. The boss paid us all a handsome bonus to keep quiet about that business. He would not take kindly to you running your mouth off." Amara's blood ran cold. It was the confirmation she needed. It was a conspiracy. Croft had paid them all off, but it was still her word against theirs. The word of an outcast against the word of the town's most powerful men. It was not enough. She needed more. Her search for a stronger weapon led her to an unlikely and reluctant source. She remembered who had been called to the scene of the crime to officially pronounce Jeb dead. Doc Miller, the town physician. He was an aging, cynical man whose hands often trembled from drink. A man haunted by past failures that the town only whispered about. He had long since traded his ideals for the bottom of a whiskey bottle. She went to his small, cluttered office, which was attached to his home at the edge of town. She found him sitting in the dark, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his eyes bleary. "What do you want?" he grunted. "I need your help. Doctor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Elias Thorne is an innocent man." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Innocence is a luxury in Redemption Gulch. Girl, same as justice. Go home. Accept the inevitable. There is nothing anyone can do." "You are wrong," she persisted, stepping closer. She knew appealing to his sense of justice would be useless. He had buried it long ago. So she appealed to the one thing he might have left, his professional pride. "You were there. You examined the body. You are a man of science, are you not?" He eyed her suspiciously. "What of it?" "The trial said Elias ambushed Jeb from a distance," she said, her mind racing, pulling facts from the air. "Did you find powder burns on the body? Around the wound?" She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Interest, perhaps, or just professional curiosity. "And the angle of the bullet? Did it match the story of a man being shot from the bushes? Or did it look like something else, something closer?" She was planting a seed of doubt, not in the town's version of the truth, but in the thoroughness of his own work. While Amara was fighting on the outside, a different kind of battle was being waged in the quiet of the jail cell. Elias was not passively waiting for death. He was preparing for it with the same stoic dignity with which he had lived his life. His thoughts drifted, not to his own fate, but to the people he had loved. He thought of Sarah and Thomas, not with the sharp, agonizing pain of his nightmares, but with a quiet, sad tenderness. He hoped that he would see them soon, and he thought of Amara. His love for her was not a regret, but a completion. He no longer saw his life as a failure, a tragic story of loss. He saw it as a life that had, however briefly, found a profound purpose in loving and protecting her. As he sat on the hard cot, replaying the events of that night over and over, his sharp, analytical mind also began to see a flaw in the trap. He remembered the sound of the gunshot as he had ridden towards the phony ravine. He had been far enough away that it had been faint, but it had been distinct, a single shot, just one. Yet, at the trial, Cole, the man who had been with Croft, had testified that he had been riding nearby and heard Jeb and Elias arguing loudly, followed by 2 quick shots. 2 shots. It was a small inconsistency, but like the one Amara had found, it was a lie. He held on to it, not as a hope for freedom, he knew that was gone, but as a piece of the truth. It was a truth he desperately wanted Amara to know, so that after he was gone, she would be certain of his innocence. Back in his office, Doc Miller could not get Amara's words out of his head. Powder burns, angle of entry. He had been drunk that night, his examination perfunctory, just enough to satisfy the sheriff. Had he missed something? Her questions had pricked not only his conscience, but his long-dormant professional curiosity. That night, driven by a force he did not understand, he did something he had not done in years. He went to the small building that served as the town's undertaker, a bottle of whiskey in his hand as a bribe for the old man who kept watch, while the undertaker drank himself into a stupor. Doc Miller lit a lantern and went to the pine box where Jeb's body lay, awaiting its burial the next day. Working by the flickering, uncertain light, his hands surprisingly steady, he re-examined the body, and he found what he now suspected he might. There were no powder burns, no stippling of gunpowder around the wound on Jeb's back. It was not a close-range shot. It was not the result of an argument. Then, with a surgeon's care, he extracted the bullet. He took it back to his office and held it under the light of his lamp. He was a man who knew firearms. He had seen more gunshot wounds than he cared to remember, and he recognized the markings on this slug of lead. It was heavy, misshapen from its impact, but the rifling grooves were distinct. It was a .50 caliber bullet from a custom-made buffalo rifle, not a .45 from a Colt Peacemaker like the one they had planted near Elias. And Doc Miller knew for a fact that there was only one man in the valley who proudly owned and was famous for using such a powerful, custom weapon, Silas Croft. He sat at his desk, the heavy lead bullet in his palm, and a tremor ran through his entire body. He had it. He had the proof, the single piece of undeniable evidence that could save an innocent man. But with that knowledge came a terrifying new reality. To reveal it meant openly accusing the most powerful, ruthless man in the territory. It meant signing his own death warrant. He struggled with his fear, a cold, sweaty thing that threatened to swallow him whole, and with a conscience he had thought long dead. He thought of the Hippocratic oath he had taken what felt like a lifetime ago, an oath to do no harm, an oath he had betrayed countless times with alcohol and cynical apathy. This was it. This was his one, final chance at some kind of redemption. The climax of his struggle came in the darkest hour of the night before the execution, with his hands trembling slightly, not from drink, but from a mixture of terror and resolve. He found Amara in her small, makeshift shelter. She looked up as he approached, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight, her eyes wide with a question she was too afraid to ask. He did not speak at first. He simply opened his hand. In his palm, catching the faint light, lay the heavy, misshapen bullet. "I took this from Jeb's body," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It is not from a Colt. It is a .50 caliber slug from a buffalo rifle." He looked at her, his old, cynical eyes now blazing with a terrifying, newfound purpose. "Croft's rifle." For a moment, Amara could not breathe. Then, hope, fierce, blinding, and almost painful, surged through her. It was real. It was proof. He was saved. But as the initial, dizzying wave of relief passed, it was replaced by an even greater danger. They had the truth, but the sun would rise in a few short hours. The gallows was already built. The town was already waiting. How could they possibly use this proof before the noose was placed around Elias's neck? They had to get the truth to the public, and they had to do it by bypassing a corrupt sheriff and a town full of men who answered to Silas Croft. Their desperate, impossible plan began to form in frantic whispers as the first faint hint of gray light appeared on the eastern horizon, heralding the dawn of execution day. The day of the execution dawned as a wound in the sky, a streak of cold, grim gray that promised no warmth. In the town square of Redemption Gulch, a crowd had gathered. They were not there to mourn a death, but to witness one. Their faces a morbidly expectant sea of pale ovals in the pre-dawn gloom. The newly built gallows, stark and angular, stood as a dark silhouette against the rising sun, a monument to the town's swift and terrible justice. Inside his cell, Elias Thorne was preternaturally calm. The fear and rage had burned away during the long, dark nights, leaving behind a hard, clear peace. He had made his final accountings with God and with his own ghosts. When a deputy brought him a final meal of steak and eggs, he refused it. He had no appetite for the world he was about to leave. Through the small, barred window, he could hear the low murmur of the crowd and the sharp, final sound of hammers making adjustments to the gallows. He did not think of the rope or the fall. His only thoughts were of Amara. He prayed with a silent, desperate intensity that she had heeded his words, that she had fled this hateful place and was riding towards a new life, a safe life. Her survival was the only thing that mattered now. In Doc Miller's cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of carbolic acid and stale coffee, he and Amara finalized their desperate, impossible plan. They both knew that a quiet word to Sheriff Brody, a private presentation of their proof, would result in them both disappearing into a shallow, unmarked grave. Their only chance, their single, terrifying roll of the dice was a public confrontation. They had to turn the town's spectacle of death into a theater of truth. Amara held the heavy, misshapen lead bullet in her palm, its weight a solid, terrifying reality. It was the object that held Elias's life in its grooves. A terrifying resolve had settled over her, burning away the last of her fear. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was an instrument of justice, and her hand would not tremble. Doc Miller, sober for the first time in what felt like years, his face pale, but his eyes clear and determined, tucked a small, loaded derringer into the inner pocket of his coat. The heavy iron door of the jail scraped open. Elias was led out into the chilly morning air, his hands bound behind his back. He walked towards the gallows with his head held high, his step steady. He did not look at the hateful, curious faces in the crowd. His eyes, calm and clear, scanned the assembled townsfolk, searching not for a last-minute reprieve, not for a friendly face, but for one impossible, heartbreaking, final look at Amara. He did not see her, and a part of him was flooded with relief. She was safe. She was gone. On the wide porch of the general store, Silas Croft stood with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the proceedings with an air of smug, absolute satisfaction. He was a titan surveying his domain, his authority now cemented by this final, public act of dominance. The drifter who had dared to defy him was about to be erased, and the woman and her precious land would finally be his. Elias mounted the 13 steps of the gallows. Sheriff Brody read the sentence in a wavering voice. A nervous-looking preacher offered a brief, mumbled prayer. Elias ignored them both, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains that represented the freedom he would never know again. The sheriff took a coarse black hood from a nail on the gallows frame, just as he moved to place it over Elias's head, to plunge him into his final darkness. A woman's voice, clear and powerful, rang out across the suddenly silent square. "Stop!" The word cut through the morning air like a knife. The crowd gasped, murmuring, turning as one to find the source. Amara pushed her way through the stunned onlookers, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. Doc Miller was right behind her, a grim, protective shadow. She did not stop until she stood at the very base of the gallows, her gaze lifting past the sheriff, past the preacher, and fixing on Silas Croft with an intensity that made the powerful man flinch. "What is the meaning of this?" Sheriff Brody sputtered, shocked by her audacity. "Deputies! Grab her!" 2 men started forward, but Doc Miller stepped in front of them, holding up a surprisingly steady hand. "Let her speak," he said, his voice firm and clear, carrying an authority no one in that town had ever heard from him. "This town deserves to hear the truth before it commits murder." A wave of confusion and excitement rippled through the crowd. Amara raised her hand, and in it, she held the lead bullet, holding it up for all to see. She spoke, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger and more confident with every word. "You have sentenced an innocent man," she began, her voice ringing with conviction. "You have been lied to at the trial. Silas Croft claimed he fired Jeb Stone for stealing payroll money, but his own man, Billy, testified that Mr. Croft paid him his wages that very same afternoon. How could a man who had just been robbed turn around and pay all his other men?" She let the question hang in the air, a seed of doubt planted. Croft's face began to darken with rage. "And now for the truth of the murder," she continued, her voice rising. She looked to Doc Miller. The doctor stepped forward, his cynicism gone, replaced by a fierce, scientific certainty. He explained his findings in clear, medical terms that even the simplest farmer could understand. He spoke of the lack of powder burns, proving Jeb had not been shot at close range during an argument. And then he delivered the final, damning piece of evidence. The bullet that killed Jebediah Stone was not from a .45 Colt, like the one found at the scene. I extracted it myself. He reached into his pocket and held up a second object. It was a .50 caliber slug, from a heavy buffalo rifle. He turned then and pointed a trembling but unwavering finger directly at the man on the porch. "It is the same kind of bullet that comes from the custom rifle that Mr. Silas Croft carries with him everywhere he goes." The crowd was stunned into a dead silence. The accusation was so direct, so audacious, it was almost impossible to believe. Croft's face turned a mottled, purplish red. He began to bluster and deny everything, his voice a furious roar. "This is an outrage, a hysterical lie from a desperate woman and a washed-up drunk. Seize them both!" But the seed of doubt had taken root. Some of the townsfolk, the ones who had chafed under Croft's thumb for years, the ones who had been forced to sell him land or who had suffered his petty cruelties, began to look at him differently. They looked at the pale, terrified face of the young ranch hand, Billy, who was standing in the crowd looking as if he was about to be sick, his eyes darting frantically between Croft and Amara. The confrontation escalated in a heartbeat. Croft, seeing his absolute power slipping from his grasp for the first time, bellowed at his men, "I said seize them! Do you hear me?" But his men hesitated. They looked at each other. And they looked at the shifting, uncertain faces in the crowd. The tide of public opinion, so long in Croft's favor, was beginning to turn. In that single, critical moment of hesitation, Elias, still standing on the gallows, acted. He was not a man to wait for salvation. He was a man who seized it, using the commotion as a distraction. He drove his head back with stunning force, smashing the hard bone of his skull into Sheriff Brody's face. The sheriff howled in pain, stumbling back, his nose erupting in a fountain of blood. With a powerful wrench of his shoulders, Elias ripped the black hood from his face and tore the thick, rough noose from around his neck, just as a deputy lunged for him. The square erupted into pure chaos. A gunfight broke out, not a classic high-noon duel, but a messy, desperate, scrambling thing. Men yelled and dove for cover. Doc Miller, his face grim, pulled the small derringer from his coat and fired a shot towards Croft's men on the porch, providing a split second of covering fire. Elias, free from the noose, tackled the lunging deputy, their bodies tumbling down the gallows steps. He got his hands on the man's pistol and came up with a weapon in his hand. He was not fighting for revenge. He was fighting for Amara, trying to get to her side, to shield her with his own body. Amidst the chaos, the young ranch hand, Billy, his nerve completely shattered by guilt and terror, finally broke. He threw his hands up to his head and screamed, his voice a high, piercing wail that cut through the gunfire. "She is telling the truth! Stop! She is telling the truth! Croft made us do it! He paid us! He killed Jeb!" That confession was the final blow. It shattered Croft's remaining authority like a pane of glass. The few men still loyal to him either threw down their guns and surrendered, or fled into the alleys. Croft, realizing in a single horrifying moment that he was finished, that his kingdom had crumbled to dust around him, made a desperate run for his horse, which was tied to the hitching post. He drew his own rifle from its scabbard, firing wildly, blindly into the crowd, a cornered animal lashing out. Elias raised the deputy's pistol, taking a steady aim. His shot was not aimed at Croft's heart, or his head. It was the shot of a man of justice, not of vengeance. The pistol bucked in his hand, and the shot was true, hitting Croft squarely in the shoulder. The impact spun the cattle baron around, sending his rifle flying from his grasp. He crashed to the ground, wounded and utterly defeated. His reign of terror over justice, when it finally came to Redemption Gulch, was swift, messy, and loud. In the aftermath, a stunned silence fell over the square. The smoke from the scattered gunshots cleared in the morning breeze. Elias was free. He stood in the middle of the chaos, the borrowed pistol hanging loosely in his hand. His eyes found Amara. She was standing right where she had been, safe, her own face a mask of disbelief and overwhelming relief. They did not speak. They did not need to. They simply came together, meeting in the center of the square, and held on to each other as if they were the only two people left in the world. Their reunion was not one of triumphant joy, not of whoops and celebration. It was one of profound, bone-deep relief, the feeling of a soul who had been drowning finally drawing a clean, clear breath. They had survived the fire. They were both scarred, forever changed by the tragedy that had almost consumed them. But they were together. Several days later, Redemption Gulch was a different town, a town trying to piece itself back together under a new, more honest leadership, with Sheriff Brody having quietly resigned in disgrace. But it was not, and could never be, a home for Elias and Amara. Their love had been forged in opposition to this place, and its very ground was stained with the memory of blood, prejudice, and pain. They packed their few salvaged belongings onto their 2 horses. They had a new rifle, a new skillet, and a small purse of money given to them by the contrite town council. They said their goodbyes to Doc Miller, who stood straighter now, his hands steady. A man who had stared into the abyss of his own failures and had found the courage to climb back out. He had found his own redemption in saving theirs. Elias and Amara rode out of town, heading west, and they did not look back. The vast, wild landscape that had once seemed so harsh and threatening now looked different. The endless plains, the distant, jagged mountains, the wide-open sky. It no longer looked like an empty wilderness. It looked like freedom. It looked like a future. Their ending was not a perfect storybook one. The scars of what they had endured and the ghosts of those they had lost would ride with them always. But they rode together, their hands clasped between their horses. Their love, a love that had been tested by fire, forged in tragedy, and proven in the face of injustice, had become their compass. It was a testament to the stubborn, unyielding truth that even in the harshest wilderness, hope can survive, and that even the most broken hearts can find a place to heal, together. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.